Welcome back to our cyberpunk dystopia, where we are learning all the ways in which we can reach a solarpunk utopia by first acknowledging all the ways we have already fucked ourselves with microplastic in our blood, with all these chemicals and all the neoliberal science, forever chemicals and all these neoliberal science that has helped to create our post-apocalyptic neoliberal dystopia, and all the ways we justify it, we moralize it, and we normalize neoliberal subjectivity in our everyday lives. Today we'll be looking at Thomas Szasz, but before we do, I'm just gonna start with a little quick rant about Health Canada trying to regulate the same Health Canada that, forces us to take certain not totally tested keywords. If I say these keywords, I mean, I'm already massively throttled anyway, so it doesn't really matter. All these videos are for the post-apocalypse, for the studies after the society has already crumbled. That's what these videos are for. So Health Canada has been trying to regulate our nutritional supplements, which is it's such a money grab. It's such a money grab in the first place. But regardless, today we're going to be talking about the medicalization of everyday life by Thomas Szasz, an amazing thinker on the same level of Hannah Arendt in terms of courage. Go against the grain. I think he died in the last 10 years, so that's unfortunate that we're losing so many of our actual intellectual thinkers, people that are able to, the guy got a medical degree, the guy went into psychiatry with qualification, meaning not the kind of qualifications that you get in a university. I mean the qualification before you make a truth statement. Ask any psychiatrist on Twitter, what are some limitations of your science? And they don't come out and actively talk about it. So when Thomas Szasz, he's really focused on psychiatry, I'm here focused on psychology, and he's all about, in a way, he's anti-psychiatry, or he's trying to limit just this medicalization of everyday life. And when he's talking about the medicalization of everyday life, I am more interested in the psychologisms of everyday life, the Hivemind idioms, and even he talks about it, the medicalized idiom, as he says right here. These idioms, and he's aware of these idioms. Metaphorical. I just want to start by saying, wow, Thomas Szasz, I mean, his whole life, if you look at all of his works, and we were going to do a work where he analyzes Breuer and Freud as a stepping stone. All these videos are one by one. Stepping stone from our last video, talking about Breuer and Freud. But I think this is his better work. I think this is my favorite work because it's just so neatly argued. I guess this is a masterpiece, really. But Thomas Szasz is one of those guys that all of his works are just really on point, let's say, and he really does a hard work to try to teach the layman about basically the destructions of the social world that we are seeing by psychiatry. And these psychiatrists are so arrogant, and that's why you have to have a strong mind, like mine, to be arrogant right back at them. So my arrogance, because of the fact that I've read so many books in contradistinction to the arrogance of the psychologists and the psychiatrists and people who think that they can socially construct our society based on their dreams. Anyway, let's get started. I'm going to start reading and interjecting as usual. Thank you for joining me. And one more thing I have to say, when we had a family gathering, and we had 30 people come over to my house, and it was really great. Family gatherings are very important, in my opinion, to do historical healing, collective healing, to make a family tree, to understand your family politics in the past, and who doesn't like who, what's going on, and the politics continue to this day. But in your lives, and to make a family tree, I think it's very important for your healing purposes, to understand those continuous historical traumas that are passed on from generation to generation. And one of my family members was talking about the benefits of meditation, and he asked me about it because he knows I do it, but he's like, how long have you been doing it? And I actually do Hindu meditation. Om Namah Shivaya. I have like dozens of memorized mantras mantras. I don't know why I started, but it's just been really beneficial to me. Hindu meditation in specifically. I don't know. I go to Hindu temples sometimes. I'm not necessarily a believer of, I'm not a believer of the dozens of gods, but I do kind of believe in spirits or, gods and some spiritual stuff. And, I've been doing it for years and been part of my healing process. And I'm so good with meditation these days that I almost don't even need it anymore. And one more thing before we get started, I put copper wire on my cell phone. And if you don't, I'm all about the vibes. Even though I might not, I might be very critical of a lot of New Ageisms. I don't think they're New Age. That's the thing. I don't think anything is New Age about all this stuff. And even though I rant and rave against all of these gurus, these fake psychologists, fake gurus, there's so many of them. These guys who make 1-minute videos, they don't understand the medium is the message. And, I've been trying to get I have a new group of students, and they're really, every year I feel like it's getting worse with the TikToks. And especially because they have made these short form videos invade other platforms as well, like Instagram and YouTube. They're all short form videos now. And I feel like this is just, people think China producing fentanyl is the revenge of the opium crisis situation in China 100 years ago. If you don't know the story, basically, long story short, the British wanted to basically get the Chinese population enslaved and addicted to opium. The king of China, technologically less advanced, says, no, you can't do that. You can't bring opium into this country. The British forcefully, 2 wars, take Hong Kong. And, I have a lot of sympathy towards the CCP I had a lot of sympathy until recently she went outside of the Constitution itself and changed the Constitution from outside the Constitution. And when you do that, you have pretty much lost legitimacy in my book. I was a big fan of China until that moment where she single-handedly took power, and I fear for what's going to happen to the Chinese project. So after she is dead, I guess, or after she has stepped down, which I don't think he'll ever do. So the point here is that people think that fentanyl is the way that, if you look at these streets, San Francisco and so on, where all these people are just zombie land. I've lived in Vancouver. I've lived in downtown Vancouver. I've seen it with my straight eyes, and it's crazy what's going on in those streets with all these people addicted. But that's not the real addiction. The real addiction is this short form video style that the Chinese government has really made to basically lower the cognitive abilities of the masses. They don't care about, they don't care about the lower class people who are just addicted. They care about attacking the middle class even, who are addicted to now short form videos. And you can see that a lot of the same parts of your brain are activated with both of these things. And the RF radiation thing, if you look at, there's new studies being done how RF radiation, just Google brain imagery cell phone. A lot of new brain imagery stuff is going on with all of the cell phone. So I put copper wire on it, so it makes all the radiation actually go in one direction. So it's not the best solution, but I do keep the cell phone away from my body at all times, and I definitely don't recommend that you sleep close to your cell phone. So that was a little preamble rant about our present dystopia. Thank you for joining me. Let's start with our reading today. I promise you this is going to be a great, poignant, very good analysis made by Thomas Szasz. And Thomas Szasz, if you don't know, he's probably the main guy that we're studying today, or studying in this series, along with Karl Kraus, who is actually a friend of this guy. And a lot of the things that he's talking about medicalization, and we're talking about here psychologism, okay? Over psychologism. We have over medicalization, we also have over psychologism. And all of these guys, psychologists and psychiatrists, they have their hand on the button. They have their hand on the legal button. They're the ones who make lines. And there's an attack on other disciplines. Psychology is forcing its point of view, and the point of view that we talked in our first video about the, P hacking, H hacking, shortcut taking, and basically neurological shortcuts. That this is the same profession that's been helping. If you've seen that Mad Men, same profession that's been helping cigarette companies get us addicted to things, okay? And the same profession in the medical world, sometimes, I don't want to, not all doctors, but doctors are here as a last resort. There's many doctors on nutrition doctors who talk about how doctors are kind of a last resort kind of thing. They tell you what to do when you're already fudged instead of living a healthy lifestyle, right? So this is the medicalization of everyday life, and all of these things connect because it's all about the prison system. And I've said before, all forms of feminism today are carceral. All forms of personalist political is neoliberal. And we've had that argument before on this channel. So hopefully you take a look. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can search tinyurl.com/intersectional essentialism to watch my Unwitting Colonizers series on the other side. This is my anti-psychology series. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. When I use the terms such as diagnosis, disease, and treatment in reference to psychiatry or psychoanalysis, it is with the understanding that we are not dealing with real, literal diagnoses, diseases, or treatment. We are dealing with the metaphorical uses of these terms. However, this medicalized idiom is an integral part of our contemporary culture. I call them hive mind idioms, #hive mind idiom. And that these terms are accepted on face value as literal diagnoses. The tyranny of experts here, diseases and treatment. Indeed, it is socially improper, embarrassing, offensive, insulting to reassert their metaphorical character. Still worse is calling attention to the practical, legal, and medical consequences that follow, linguistically and logically, from identifying and, quote, treating, quote, non-diseases as diseases. My writing is about mental illness and psychiatry. For 20 years, this guy's been writing and writing and writing. Nobody listens to him. Reflect my insistence on making this simple but fundamental distinction, and nobody listens. Because neoliberal science doesn't listen. Neoliberal academia doesn't listen. Defund academia. That's my new hashtag. Defund academia. We're gonna defund the police. The police are not holding down neoliberal colonialism. It's the academics. It's the unwitting academics. And you can check out you can Google Global Theory Industry by Gabriel Rockhill, although I disagree with him a lot with regards to Hannah Arendt, Zizek, and many others. He goes after Hannah Arendt and Zizek, and he upholds the feminist paradigm for some reason. However, I do like his methodology, so check out his Global Theory Industry. Critiques on Zizek and Arendt are so weak, in my opinion. Calling this distinction simple is not the same as saying that it's easy to grasp or accept. That's the thing. Because when your whole careerist bullshit is tied to it, you cannot accept it. So there was this, in physics, let's go to even harder science, let's say. In physics, there's this whole story that I heard in college. I don't even know if it's real. But a young physicist comes and does a lecture, and he was doing a lecture on something that an old physicist had spent 50 years working on. And basically he debunked everything that the guy said from scratch. And basically the old guy was the first guy to get up and give him a clap because, that's real science. In hard science, now that's the thing, we've been, since our first study on the 7 sins of psychology, we said even hard science is even subject to this system, right? The hard science that is funding the military-industrial complex, for example, that has no ethical perspective on things or whatever. Even hard science is affected by neoliberal science. However, hard science, maybe perhaps in physics or something that you just can't say no, 1 + 1 is 2, right? Logic, and it's logical, although 1 doesn't exist probably in the real world. That's a big debate about whether math is a tool or math is a discovery. Regardless, countless writers have remarked on the remarkable properties of language and on the profound connections between language, thought, religion, science, and social existence in general. One of the most elegant and lucid statements that I've come across is the following: metaphors are a valuable literary device. They enrich language by making it dramatic and colorful, rendering abstract concepts concrete, condensing complex concepts into a few words, and unleashing creative and analogical insights. But Their uncritical use can lead to confusion and distortion. And this is the thing, right? There's a lot of debate. When there's a debate between two people, a lot of the times, half the people are debating. They are the type of people that need strict definitions on things, and the other half of the people are people who are comfortable with not defining your terms before the debate, people who are comfortable with open definitions. And that's set theory. That's a whole set theory thing. So these two types of people, a lot of times they get into miscommunications because they just have a different way of seeing the world. At its heart, metaphor compares two or more things that are, in fact, identical. A metaphor's literal meaning is used non-literally in a comparison with its subject. While the comparison may yield useful insights, the dissimilarities between the metaphor and its subject, if not acknowledged, can pollute one's understanding of the subject. That's why they say analogy is the weakest form of argument. If attributes of the metaphor are erroneously or misleadingly assigned to the subject, the distortion goes unchallenged, then the metaphor may alter the understandings of the underlying subject. The first thing that comes to mind is how intersectionality makes analogies between different forms of oppression and then tries to push everything together and tries to be like, look at this analogy is related to this analogy, and being a woman is like being a slave. And that's basically what happens in intersectional analysis. Sometimes some people do this very one-dimensional analysis, even though it's supposed to be multi-dimensional. It's just smushing together metaphors, smushing together analogies that just don't belong. And as a philosopher, it's really annoying when you have all of these people making these analogies and just not understanding. It's not like I'm saying they don't understand basic logic, because I don't like to bring basic logic into everyday language. That's, I think, a mistake by itself as well. Regardless, the more appealing and powerful a metaphor, the more it tends to supplant or overshadow the original subject, and the more one is unable to contemplate the subject apart from its metaphorical formulation. Again, this is some people that are too into the open definition kind of thing. You have to play around closed definitions and open definition. So closed definition, so you can cut things off and be like, this doesn't apply. But people who are too artistic in their thinking, sometimes they just graft on to the metaphor, and they graft it so tightly that they can't even distinguish that it was a metaphor in the first place. Thus, distortions perpetuated by the metaphor are sustained and even magnified. This is the lesson of the wall of separation. Wonderful. So what I said before in my last video is that the metaphor of a diagnosis starts to live a life of its own, and people start to think that it's a real thing. And we can see the limitations of these metaphors when these psychological subjects become a matter of public debate. These psychological terms become a matter of public debate because we can see that the idea of boundaries doesn't have any boundary. And this too is a lesson of mental illness metaphor. The mental illness metaphor. So for Thomas Szasz, mental illness has always been a metaphor. He's been arguing this stuff for, he has like 20 books or something. And unfortunately, rest in peace, Mr. Thomas Szasz. If you can hear this in give me some juice. Give me some juice so I can popularize, or however mediocrely popularize, your already popular work that's just disregarded by people who don't want to listen, basically. Introduction. Woe unto you, for ye have taken away the key of knowledge. Luke 11:52. What is medicalization? And remember, we're going to make a metaphor here. The metaphor between medicalization and psychologization, or over-psychologization, or psychologism, which itself is a debatable term. The Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. See, I like how he talks about that, because we made the distinction between people who think about things in terms of fixed definitions and people who think in metaphor. So he's starting that conversation even within the second page, right? Defines the definition of medicalize as to view or treat as a medical concern, problem, or disorder, and offers this phrase as illustration. Those who seek to dispose of social problems by medicalizing them. Unfortunately, we see that the Merriam-Webster Webster Dictionary is a site of political conflict as well. Everything is, the personal is political, so the dictionary itself, even the word, for example, the patriarchy, isn't really the patriarchy anymore. You search up the patriarchy, the definition has always been rule by the father, but now it's all men rule all women for some reason, even though it's never been that. Even though that's never existed. It's just been ruled by the father. It's a different freaking thing, okay? Anyway. Accordingly, we speak of medicalization of homosexuality and racism, but do not speak of the medicalization of malaria and melanoma. He starts with this issue right here. I mean, one of the things is alcoholism, right? And I think he's going to talk about alcoholism as well. Alcoholism as a disease. The concept of medicalization, and the thing is, when you talk about that, there's a lot of these people who have been trained by the psychological industry to have negative reactions, and there were already probably people who have negative reactions, but they've been basically equipped to not even question anymore and just call you ignorant and be like, do you think medicalization is not, alcoholism isn't a disease? The South Park did a whole episode on Randy being like, it's a disease, god damn it, go. Perhaps it's a disease. There's no qualification anymore. Sorry, I keep going on rants. The concept of medicalization rests on the assumption that some phenomena belonging in the domain of medicine and some do not. Accordingly, we agree on clearly defined criteria that define membership in the class called so-called disease or medical problem. It is fruitless to debate whether any particular act of medicalization is valid or not. It's a metaphor. Everything that we do or happens to us affects or depends on the use of our body. In principle, we could treat everything that people do or that happens to them as belonging to the domain of medicine. Conversely, we could maintain that nothing we do or happens to us belongs in the domain of medicine because all is ordained by God and belongs to the domain of religion. I like that much better, okay? I like that perspective, okay? That's my perspective. Theological. I don't necessarily mean ordained by God, but there is the ideological aspect. And that's actually a good perspective, a good comparison, because it's ideological rather than anything else. Maybe I'm over-ideologizing. I actually talk about this point in the end of my Habermas analysis in my Carrying Over the Burdens of Trace master's thesis, or you can look at my Ritual Trace series where I talk about that as well. Such, indeed, was the case in ancient times before people distinguished between faith healing and medical healing. A similar view held by Christian scientists whose faith is based on radical denial and the reality of the material world. On a radical denial of the reality of the material world. For them, only the spiritual realm exists or is real. Quote, nothing belongs to the domain of material medicine. Christian science represents the most radical case, demedicalization possible. Mary Baker Eddy's foundational work, Let Us Remember, was entitled Science and Health with the Key to the Scripture, 1875. Contemporary public health may be regarded as the mirror image of Christian science. Everything in our lives, housing, food, education, work, recreation, procreation, affects our health. Therefore, everything is psychological, over psychological, okay? And I've talked about maybe it's the fact that is a good point to, talk about the psychology of politics, or that everything is psychological. We have to qualify everything. People don't even qualify anything anymore. Therefore, everything, not only healthcare, narrowly defined, belongs in the domain of medicine as healthcare. Therefore, everything, not only healthcare narrowly defined, belongs in the domain of healthcare. Linda Landsman, a former president of the Public Health Association of New York City, states, we expect and demand that the government ensure that we breathe clean air, drink safe water, work with minimum danger, have medications where the benefits outweigh the risks, and receive quality healthcare. Left on our own, we don't always make the healthiest choices. I was down with the demand until she said, left on our own, we don't always make the healthiest choices. Freedom is so key to all of this. I mean, we talked about that in our last video. We can't do anything without freedom. In this view, we are uninformed, undisciplined children whose health and well-being required the unremitting protection of the therapeutic, dare I say, nanny state. I don't want to get all left-wing, right-wing, but that's definitely a right-wing talking point. In practice, we must draw a line between what counts as medical care and what does not. And the reason, we have to move beyond this left-wing, right-wing. That's just, someone's going to cut that out and be like, you're a right-wing bastard. The question is where to draw that line. The question is where to draw that line. And that's the biggest question. The line between what? The line between legal insanity and illegal insanity. What is a disease and what is not? What should be treated medically by physicians or medical personnel, and what should not? Because people in modern societies expect the state to defray all or part of the costs of what is deemed a medical service, where we draw the line between, quote, healthcare and, quote, not healthcare is informed more by economic and political considerations than by medical or scientific judgment. And that's not something that I want to rest on. I don't want to rest on scientism, but I guess we have to, because that's what the whole profession is about. Moreover, not only must we demarcate diseases from non-diseases, we must also distinguish between medicalization from above by coercion and medicalization from below by choice. Not by coincidence, these strategies match psychiatry's two paradigmatic legal social functions: civil commitment and the insanity defense, social control, and excuse making. The difference between disease as objective physical condition and patient role as social status is obvious, provided we are willing to see it, providing we are making those qualifications. Having a disease and occupying the patient role are independent variables. Not all sick persons are patients, and not all patients are sick. Physicians, politicians, the press, the public, nevertheless continues to confuse and conflate the two categories. This is a cultural setting conducive to the growth of medicalization. The oblivious and the same kind of cultural setting is what makes these narcissists become big deals. And narcissists becoming big deals in the social activism circle. Oblivious of the distinction between diagnosis and disease, and between disease and patient role. Even critics who recognize it, that the American furor diagnosticus is spiraling out of control. Out of control are helpless. For example, in the Wall Street Journal, 1997, Jim Windolph, executive director of the New York Observer, stated, quote, "The experts won't be satisfied until every last American is suffering from some kind of disease or disorder or syndrome." And remember, we're living in a time when they are medicalizing, psychiatrizing masculinity, right? Just like how we did with homosexuality many years ago. If you add together all the numbers compiled in the US by all the institutes, the councils, the foundations, the PhDs and authors, you come up with a sorry statistical portrait of the nation. With another new quantifiable disorder or two, everybody in America will officially be nuts. Being officially nuts is like being officially heretical or un-American, not like being infected with malaria. This point may be clarified by adding a few remarks about the opposite of medicalization, that is demedicalization. Masturbation and homosexuality were, until relatively recently, considered diseases. Oh, it's a disease! Leave me alone. Today, they no longer are. Have they been cured out of existence? No, they have been demedicalized. At the same time, hundreds of behaviors or habits never before treated as medical problems are now diagnosed as diseases. Drug abuse, social anxiety, factitious disorder. Have these new diseases been discovered? No, they have been invented by the publish or die neoliberal industry that everybody wants to get careerist points. That is, they are the products of medicalization. Moreover, these new diseases have been created pari passu with huge advances in scientific detection of bodily diseases. Scientism coming in and backing up these claims. Ironically, technological advances in medicine, combined with the conflation of concepts of disease and patient role, facilitate not only medicalization, but also the confusion between discovering diseases and creating diagnosis. As a result, when behaviors categorized as diseases are declassified, as happened with homosexuality, journalists, science writers, and the public are easily persuaded by the stakeholders in medicalization that demedicalization is also a product of scientific progress. and more enlightenment, and not the product of a power struggle between stigmatizers and stigmatized. And as we talked about before, that power struggle was within the early Vienna circle itself, criticized by Thomas Szasz's friend Karl Kraus, and as we've already hinted at in this series, tinyurl.com/antipsychology. Medicalization is not a new phenomenon. Neither is demedicalization, about which more in a moment. Wherever diseases or disabled persons receive care or are excused from certain obligations, the condition is ripe for non-diseased and non-disabled individuals to pretend that they are sick or disabled. Same thing is happening with intersectionality, eh? Carrie Bourassa! Search it. Carrie Bourassa. Formerly, people spoke out about, people with 1/16 Native American blood get tax breaks in this country. Formally, I don't know what the number should be, but a lot of people who aren't really that, native, like Carrie Bourassa is 0% native. There's a bunch of these people. Carrie Bourassa was just high up on the ledge where she was caught. Formerly, people spoke about imaginary diseases and persons who pretended to be ill. Molière, 1622 to 1673, the great satirist of malingers and of the quacks whose harmful administrations they invite, titled one of his plays The Imaginary Invalid, Le Malade Imaginaire. Among his memorable characters is Lucinda, a young bride in The Doctor of Spite himself, who pretended to be unable to speak to avoid having to marry an old man her father wanted her to wed. Hysterical aphonia. Medicalization from below, from powerlessness, that is, malingering or self-medicalization, is an old phenomenon. Medicalization from above, that is, medicalization of the other to control and punish, is later development, associated with the birth of psychiatry. Ward number 6, a gripping short story by Anton Chekhov, 1860 to 1904, is an outstanding literary representation of psychiatry as a medicalization from above. Andrew Efemek, the madhouse doctor who in the end is himself incarcerated as mad, addressed an inmate who begs to be freed. You ask me what is to be done. The best thing to do in your situation is to escape from here. But regrettably, that is useless. You would be detained when society fences itself off from criminals, psychopaths, and people who are generally embarrassing. It is insuperable. There is but one thing left for you: to find reassurance in the thought that your staying here is necessary. Since prisons and madhouses exist, why somebody is bound to sit in them. Since prisons and madhouses exist, why somebody is bound to sit in them. If not you, then I. If not I, some third person. Bide your time. When in the distant future prisons and madhouses will have gone out of existence, there will be no more bars on windows nor hospital robes. Of course, sooner or later, such a time will come. A more recent literary example of medicalization as medical ideology minus psychiatry is a satirical play by Jules Romain, Dr. Knock. Dr. Knock, the protagonist, declares, "Healthy people are sick who don't know it." Get sick is an old idea. It can't stand up to modern science. Health is a word we could just as well erase from our vocabularies. It's a matter of principle with me to regard the entire population as our patients, ipso facto. If you think it's over, you'll be struck by its relation to the admirable concept of the nation in arms, a concept into which our modern states derive their strength. All right, I'm going to give a little qualification here and say, yeah, we do have a collective historical trauma we are dealing with as society. So he has a point. We'll see. But this is not, I like to qualify everything. This image soon became stark reality in Germany, where physicians rushed to abandon the Hippocratic tradition and assume the roles of biological soldiers in the service of Vaterland. He knows a thing or two about as an Austrian. How are we to understand medicalization and the confusion that reigns about what counts as disease? Not by attributing it to scientific progress or cultural forces, as psychiatrists and psychiatric apologists won't do, but by identifying the medicalizers and exposing their motives. The view advanced by Charles Rosenberg, a distinguished professor of the history of science and social science at Harvard University, is characteristically misleading. Medicalization might perhaps be understood as long-term trend in Western society towards reductionist, somatic, and increasingly disease-specific explanations of human feelings and behaviors, as well as unambiguously physical ills. I'm thinking of the Hivemind idiom toxic. Everybody's using that word to describe everything a couple of years ago. Behavioral and emotional ills seem more accessible than somatic ills to lay people who often question such categories as depression or attention deficit, but rarely interrogate and are generally unaware of the indeterminacy built into the diagnosis or staging of a somatic ill such as cancer, but the range of human dilemmas that we ask medicine to address as if anything expanded from depression to anxiety, from bereavement to dysfunctional marriage. So long as medicine in general, and psychiatry in particular, remains our designated manager of such problems, specific disease categories will always be indispensable tool in the performance of that social role. Psychiatry and its concepts bleed constantly and unavoidably into the larger culture. That's psychiatry. Psychiatry bleeds into the popular culture. Psychology floods the popular culture with all of these hive mind idioms. That's what our real critique is. We're looking at what's going on in psychiatry. I'm not qualified to be critiquing psychiatry because it's a medical thing and you have to have a doctor degree and you need to know all that stuff. But I am definitely qualified to critique, as a philosopher, I'm definitely qualified to critique the soft sciences. Note that Rosenberg and the reason why that's a strategy here. It's a thinking strategy because psychology and psychiatry, one is the more scientific than the other one is more scientism. So he's attacking psychiatry itself. When we attack psychiatry itself, that's even a stronger argument for the weaker argument that I want to make, the much easier argument to make about how psychology is bullshit. Anti-psychology, that's the point of this whole video series. And what are we doing in the video series? I'm doing open research about my own book. So every really poignant book that I find, I'm going to be doing this kind of analysis with you in an open public way, and then finally by the end, hopefully in a couple, let's say a year, we're gonna have the book published, self-published, because we all know the academia needs to be defunded because it's bullshit. Note, because you have to repeat everything that they say in order to get published these days, and that's basically what neoliberal science does. Note that Rosenberg contrasts human feelings and behavior, and physical ills, and behavior ills, somatic ills, but does not tell us what his criteria are for distinguishing between them. Medicalization is not an impersonal process as Rosenberg pretends. It is a psychiatric propaganda, not historical analysis. In Rosenberg's account of medicalization, this guy's a psychiatrist, by the way. There are no agents, no winners or losers, and no one is responsible for the process. Psychiatry, that is the manufacturer of fictitious diseases, bleeds into the larger culture. So he's talking about a guy who's, this is what Iron Manning is all about, basically. I'm Iron Manning someone, he's Iron Manning even more. Bleeding may be started or stopped. Homosexuality became a mental illness when psychiatrists wielding social power claimed that it became a non-disease when the homosexual lobby became powerful and troublesome enough to force psychiatrists to abolish the diagnosis. The story of medicalization and demedicalization of homosexuality highlights that medical classification, the linguistic concept ordering of the phenomenon we call disease, and of the interventions we call treatments is a human activity, governed by human interest. In the United States today, the forces of medicalization rule virtually unopposed, indeed unrecognized for the economic, moral, and political interests that they represent. And now we're going to take a quick sidestep into Agamben. Look at my defense of Agamben video. Google, or you can't Google it because my YouTube is throttled. Go on my YouTube and type defense of Agamben, because Agamben, he talks about how neoliberalism and medicalization are really hand in hand. It's so difficult to read because it's just so emotional. Like, there's all these people in prisons and they're just being drugged, and they're just drug dealers. I mean, they're just legalized drug dealers, these psychiatrists. They have the same vibe. They say, hey, you want some drugs? They do the same shit. For millennia, the regulation of drug use was a matter of self-control, custom, religion, law. Thinking about the war on drugs, we should have a war on TikTok. We should have a war on short-form video. This is still, in part, the case. I have to go back and do my Marshall McLuhan analysis at some point. More importantly, however, drug use is regulated by ostensibly medical scientific, quote, facts, quote, objective facts, and medical legal controls, exemplified by a broadly based drug prohibition consisting of prescription laws and the criminalization of trade in many drugs, heroin and marijuana. This is a drug medicalization from above. Drug medicalization from below is pursued no less zealously by individuals who, while ostensibly opposed to our drug laws, promote so-called medical marijuana initiatives, physician-assisted suicide, and similar schemes. And we're seeing the results of physician-assisted suicide. People who can't afford homes in Canada, that's like a legitimate reason for a physician-assisted suicide these days. The result is a loss of self-ownership and the right to self-medication, the classic liberal/libertarian perspective on drug use. It would be difficult to exaggerate the importance of distinguishing between two kinds of patient roles, one forcibly ascribed, another voluntarily assumed. In psychiatry, the patient role is typically ascribed to persons diagnosed as psychotic or schizophrenic and is typically assumed by persons diagnosed as suffering from hypochondriasis, hysteria, conversion reaction, somatization, and factitious illnesses, and so forth. It reminds me in the legal profession, they have all these terms in the legal profession, and the reason why they have all these terms that it's so difficult doesn't have to be so difficult. The reason why it's so difficult is because they're trying to hide something. They're trying to hide all of this destruction. We really do live in a cyberpunk dystopia. It's so difficult to wrap your head around just how many dystopic things that are going on. In his influential book, The Concept of the Mind, philosopher Gilbert Ryle introduced the concept of category error. Ryle's thesis was simple, indeed elementary. The prediction of substances is not meaningful for disposition or capacity. Therefore, it is a mistake to treat the mind as an object, because the mind is not an object. Like the body, it is a mistake to apply the predicate, quote, disease to it. The, quote, diseased mind is a metaphor, a mistake, a myth. And we're going to go back to that definition. Okay, 1 + 1 is 2. 1 + 1 is 2. Why? You can get a circle, you get another circle, and then you get a bigger circle. Okay, that's one way. Geometrically, we can describe that 1 + 1 is 2. But does a 360-degree circle exist in the real world? No, it's a name. 1 is a name. It's 1 = 1. And we got to teach basic logic and They try to teach math, but they don't teach basic logic, proofs in math. They should be teaching that, since we're kids. So, one way to look at it is, what is a name? A name equals a name. A name isn't a definition. A name is not a definition. What's the definition of a table? A flat surface with 4 legs or whatever, 3 legs, or a stable flat surface, whatever you want to define it. It has a definition, has what Aristotle would call, has an end. Okay, it's teleological. But a human, what's the definition of Tom? Tom doesn't have a definition, because Tom is a name. Tom equals Tom. Just like 1 = 1. 360-degree perfect circle is a 360-degree perfect circle. It doesn't exist in the real world. Okay, it's always changing. Tom is always changing. You can't define Tom. Kant. We're talking about Kant. We're talking about basic freaking philosophy. These people aren't trained in. This is not a new idea. None of this is a new idea. Nobody listens to these people. I found 300 books talking about this crap and nobody freaking listens to it. Why? Because of freaking neoliberal science, neoliberal control, read some Agamben. Emil Kraepelin, the creator of the first modern psychiatric nosology, acknowledged the fundamental analytic truth that there are no mental illnesses. In his class's lectures on clinical psychiatry, he stated, the subject of the following course of lectures will be the science of psychiatry, which, as its name implies, is that the treatment is that of the treatment of mental disease. Seelenheilkund. Can't read any German freaking words. It is true that in the strictest terms, we cannot speak of the mind as becoming diseased. Half a century earlier, the Viennese psychiatrist Ernst von Fachtensleben explicitly emphasized the analogical, metaphorical character of illness. The maladies of the spirit alone, in abstracto, that is, error and sin, can be called diseases of the mind only per analogium. Analogy. They come not with the jurisdiction of the physician, but that of a teacher or clergyman, who again are called physicians of the mind, only per analogium. Another rant. All these freaking atheists, fake atheists, don't understand what theology is. Freaking amazing atheists. Freaking the four horsemen of atheism. Sam Harris. They don't understand ideology. They don't understand ontotheology. However, Ryle's concept of category error is grievously incomplete. It ignores that treating the mind, mental symptom, mental illness, psychopathology, the unconscious included. We already talked about that. The unconscious is, where is consciousness? Where is unconscious? As an object may be a strategy, not an error or mistake. That the error is not innocent. That today there is fame, money, power, and escape from responsibility in the medicalization of everyday life. This was all way before, 20 years before, all of this work was all 20 years before it's too much unpaid emotional labor to educate you. Hivemind idiom that psychology legitimized. The escape from responsibility that psychology legitimized. The transformation of religious explanations and controls into medical explanations and controls of behavior is one of the monumentous consequences of the Enlightenment. Consequences. I'm having a debate with my aunt who loves philosophy and stuff. She's very old school. She's talking about progress. I have to explain to her, what is progress? I mean, this is just you called me a postmodernist. It's not postmodernism. It's just, anyway. What the heck is progress? The waning power of religion and the church and the waxing power of science and the nation state is manifested, among other things, by the political control of medical practice and the drug laws that deny access to lay persons to drugs, except those classified as over-the-counter. To legally obtain or possess a prescription drug, the lay person must establish a professional relationship with a licensed physician and receive diagnosis for an illness. He must be a patient who suffers from a proven or putative illness. For example, to receive a sleeping pill, the person must suffer from insomnia. This charade contributes mightily to the medicalization rampant to our society. So think about what he's saying here. He's saying that there's an aspect of scientism, there's an aspect of legitimization that's happening there. It's the continuation of the church confessional, which isn't a problem if it was marked out as theological, but it's not. It's marked out as scientific. With scientific, moral, and so in turn, medicalization is mindly equated, especially by the cognoscenti, by the academics, by the people who think they are smart, with scientific, moral, and social progress, and contributes further to its popularity. Now, you saw this with the whole, the keyword, I don't know, I'm already throttled, but that keyword, that will definitely throttle me for the last 2 years we've had. Look at even me, right? Everybody, I should listen to the scientists. Couple freaking months later, look at all the problems I don't want to talk about that specific issue that we've had for the last 3 years, but look at my Agamben video about that. Agamben was the first one who had the cojones to come out and say it as it is. And all the philosophers, the so-called philosophers, who were throwing out Agamben's words because they are part of this legitimizing process. Check out my defense of Agamben video. So important. I'm going to actually put that video in the playlist. Although medicalization encompasses more than psychiatry, we must be clear about one thing. Psychiatry is medicalization. Through and through. Again, we're criticizing psychiatry, which is the supposedly stronger science than psychology. If all this is happening with psychiatry, what's happening with psychology? Much worse. It's much worse with psychology. Whatever aspect of psychiatry whatever aspect of psychiatry psychiatrists claim is not medicalization only if it deals with proven diseases, in which case it belongs to neurology, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, neurochemistry, neuropharmacology, or neurosurgery, not psychiatry. Psychoanalysis is medicalization squared. If psychoanalysis is medicalization squared, psychology is squared. It is important in this connection not to be fooled by lay analysis. He's worried about lay analysis in psychiatry. Look at all the freaking lay analysis happening in psychology. Clinical psychology or social work talks about it. These and non-medical mental health and counseling so-called professions, I love it. I love that he did that. Professions. I'm criticizing the profession. The profession. The professors. Professing. The prophets of psychology are medicalization cubed. These are not, yeah, he's saying. So that's what I said, right? Squared, that's cubed, right? Oh, sorry, his mathematics are better than mine. As if to compensate for their lack of medical qualification. Oh, he's talking about psychology then. As if to compensate for their lack of medical qualifications, non-medical mental health so-called professionals. Ugh, thank you, Thomas. Where is your face? Mwah, mwah. You're such an ugly guy, but doesn't matter. I mean, I'm sure you looked good when you were young. I love you, Mr. Thomas Szasz. Ugh, I want to cry. I just want to cry, okay? Ugh. Look at my Why Men Don't Cry video. Men do cry, okay? Men don't cry is a freaking Hivemind idiom. It's never fucking been true. Check out my bell hooks video. Are medicalized cubed as if to compensate for their lack of medical qualifications. Non-medical mental health so-called professionals, oh my god, I've gotten to the debates with these people on Twitter, are even more deeply committed than psychiatrists to their claim of special expertise in the diagnosis and treatment of mental illnesses. By the time Freud appeared on the historical stage, medicalization was in full swing. The birth of psychoanalysis is in fact a manifestation of the increasing popularity of this trend at the end of the 19th century, as well as a cause of its explosive growth during the 20th century. In 1901, and this is what Karl Kraus says, is Freud really something new? Wittgenstein said, is Freud really something new? In 1901, Freud published one of his favorite works, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. The gist of Freud's thesis was that symptoms of mental illnesses are the products of the same mental processes that are responsible for the thoughts and actions of normal persons. In other words, Freud rediscovered that there is madness, there is method in madness, or as he preferred to put it, that sane and insane behaviors are subject to the same so-called psychological laws. To create his special brand of pseudoscience, he titled his book The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. He just could have easily titled it The Everyday Normality of the Psychopathological Life. There would, of course, have been neither fame nor fortune in that. Instead, he chose to inflame medicalization and managed to transform a smoldering fire into an all-consuming conflagration. At the same time, because Freud knew better, his attitude towards medicalization throughout his life was ambivalent and opportunistic. Most of the time, he was an enthusiastic medicalizer. The neurosis, I mean, yeah, look at his, what was it? And this girl who comes up and she's like, oh, I have a knee pain. And he's like, oh, do you have a sexual fetish with your father? The neurosis are a particular kind of illnesses, and analysis is a particular method of treating them, a specialized branch of medicine. The first, it's difficult. Freud, that's why we need Wittgenstein here. The first piece of reality with which the patient must deal is his illness. The neurosis, are severe, constitutionally fixed illnesses which rarely restrict themselves to only a few attacks, but persists as a rule over long periods or throughout life. I was thus led into regarding the neurosis as being, without exception, disturbances of the sexual function. Freud and his sexual obsession. My medical conscience felt pleased at my having arrived at this conclusion. Psychoanalysis is really a method of treatment like others. At other times, when it suited his purpose, Freud resisted the medicalization of psychoanalysis. That's the thing. Again, that's why we need Wittgenstein. I have assumed, that is to say, that psychoanalysis is not a specialized branch of medicine. I cannot see how it's possible to dispute is not. In his medical school, a doctor receives a training which is more or less the opposite of what he would need as a preparation for psychoanalysis. It may perhaps turn out that in this instance, the patients are not like the other patients. We analysts serve the patient as teacher and educator. Furthermore, it is in the psychopathology of everyday life that Freud lays claim to the mantle of scientist. If the distinction between conscious and unconscious motivation is taken into account, our feeling of conviction informs us that conscious motivation does not extend to all our our motor decisions. That what is thus left free by the one whose side receives its motivation from the other side, from the unconscious. And in this way, determination in the physical sphere is still carried out without any gap. Freud believed that his allegiance to scientific determinism and the denial of free will were evidence of his scientific bona fide. In fact, they revealed the conventionality of his cast of mind, how he casts the mind. In large part, Freud labored in some vineyard of sexual medicalization that his colleague Baron Richard von Krafft-Ebing had staked out. He extended Krafft-Ebing's psychopathologizing of behavior from sexual life, everyday life, inverting Shakespeare's proto-existential interpretations of human conflict into dehumanized interpretations of tragedy as symptoms of psychopathology. That's a great point. Now we can't even read Shakespeare without Freud. Krafft-Ebing, a German-born professor of psychiatry of Vienna, was a world-famous figure, largely because of his sensational book caused by his book Psychopathia Sexualis. Thanks to his pioneering efforts, sexual desires and aversions in their manifold forms became an integral part of medicine and the new science of psychiatry. To impress the medical character of his work on the profession of the public, Krafft-Ebing sprinkled his text liberally with Latin, and he and his publisher alike maintained that Psychopathia Sexualis was written only for medical professionals, solely for medical use. In the preface of the edition, Krafft-Ebing wrote, "The object of this treatise is merely to record the various psychopathological manifestations of sexual life in man. The physician finds perhaps a solace in the fact that he may at times refer those manifestations which offend against our ethical and aesthetic principles to a diseased condition of the mind or of the body." I list without further comment some of the diseases Krafft-Ebing identified as cerebral neurosis, anesthesia, absence of sexual instinct, hyperanesthesia, increased desire, satyriasis, paresthesia, perversion of the sexual instinct, fetishism, invents imaginary presentations of separate body parts of the body or portions of raiment of the opposite sex with voluptuous sensation. This reminds me of those at Key and Peele where these guys are supposed anthropologists going into different societies and being like, oh, well, I had to participate in customs. The public memory is short. Towards the end of the 19th century, doctors transformed diverse human sexual appetites and practices into a Latin dictionary of diseases. 100 years later, they transformed many of those diseases, for example, masturbation, pornography, and prostitution, to sex therapy. The new quacks, led by William Masters and Virginia Johnson, became celebrated, quote, doctors, quote, and, quote, scientists, quote. Their best-selling sex manuals were full of gems about medicalization, such as this one, a physician, frankly quite curious about the partner's surrogate role, offered her services to evaluate the potentials, if any, of the role. When convinced of the desperate need for such a partner in the treatment of sexual dysfunction in the unmarried male, she continued as a partner surrogate, contributing both personal and professional experiences to develop the role to a peak effectiveness. The therapists, that is Masters and Johnson, are indeed more indebted to this intelligent woman. This is medicalization running amok. Note that Masters and Johnson speak of being indebted to this woman. They do not call her a doctor or a physician or prostitute, and do not tell us whether or how much she charged for her sex therapy sessions. People do not have to be told that malaria and melanoma are diseases. They know they are. But people have to be told, and are told over and over and over again, with hive mind idioms, that alcoholism and depression are diseases. Why? Because people know that they are not, that mental illnesses are not like other illnesses, that mental hospitals are not like other hospitals, and that business of psychiatry is coercion, not cure. Accordingly, medicalizers engage in a never-ending task of, quote, educating people, defund academia, people that non-diseases are diseases. It's getting worse. This was 2015, I think this book came out, but all of these essays are older than that. The Johnson Institute, founded by Dr. Vernon Johnson, an Episcopal priest and self-styled recovered alcoholic, is one of the American, and we all know the first, what was it, in South Park, the first thing that you do in alcohol and AA is to recognize that there's a higher power, is one of the major American anti-alcoholism organization. The Institute's aim is to medicalize the drinking of alcoholic beverages. At a forum held by the National Press Club in 2004, attended by 50 leaders representing 85 organizations, Dr. David C. Lewis, founder of the Center for Alcoholism and Addiction Studies at Brown University, explained, addiction treatment needs to be concerned a more mainstream medical procedure, such as treatments for cancer, depression, and other chronic diseases. Dr. Hunsker, president of the CEO of the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers, warned, the focus must be to keep addictions as a public health issue and not a social services. We must resist every attempt to have alcoholism and drug addiction seen as anything but a medical issue. It's a primary disease, not a symptom, some other disease, not a symptom of the disenchantment of the world, nothing that the philosophers can talk about. The medicalizers of depression are equally numerous and aggressive. One group of depression medicalizers, the, quote, Depression is Real Coalition, you can see it's the same freaking hashtags. What hashtags am I talking about? Stop pill shaming hashtag. Go search pill shaming hashtag, slut shaming hashtag. All of these people that are making activism, medicalization activism, psychologism activism. It's the same thing. You see it everywhere. Be aware of it. Even, what is it? I'm gonna be an activist too, you know? When you hear locker room talk, I want you to have locker room talk by meaning medicalization talk or psychologization talk. It's your responsibility, okay, to stop it. As a feminist, okay, it's your responsibility to stop this bullshit, to stop the hive mind idioms as a philosopher. But that's not what's happening in philosophy today. There's no philosophy happening in the academic fucking towers anymore. Philosophy is happening in the Wendy's. Whenever you hear that hive mind idioms, sir, this is just a Wendy's. Yeah, because that's where philosophy is today. That's why I hate buying McDonald's. I have good deals and I fucking hate it. I have good deals. I have to go for the sandwich in the morning because I have to run to work. The coalition's website states that it is a group of 7 nonprofit organizations representing doctors, people living with mental illnesses, and American communities. We have come together to help, educate the public about the true nature of depression and offer hope when people speak in cliches. It's like when they do, I've already ranted about this, but I'm going to rant about it again. When they do inauthentic land acknowledgements. This is the land of the Vishwaname people. Dude, if you're going to do a land acknowledgement, make it from the freaking heart. Say, fuck, we colonized people. We're living on their fucking land. We destroyed their fucking water. We destroyed our water. They shared their shit, and we gave them fucking diseases. Real diseases. Smallpox. That's a fucking real land acknowledgement. Speak from the freaking heart. Anyway, sorry. Dr. Paul Grenard. Every year without any treatment at all, thousands stop suffering from depression because it kills them. We want people to realize that depression is very real and very serious medical illness with a biological basis. You see, the way they talk. Alcoholism is a real depression. Depression is real. But if you watch TV, read the popular press, or search the internet, you will find all kinds of confusing messages. You may have heard that depression is just the blues. Or worse, you made up disease. Those kinds of statements obscure the real facts about deliberate, debilitating, and potentially deadly medical condition that affects 19 million people. So give us some grant money right now. So while depression is real, hope is real too. God damn it. So I can't not read it like that. I'm sorry. Formerly, people felt depressed or were depressed. Now they have it. Formerly, some depressed people killed themselves, but most did not. Now people do not kill themselves. Depression kills them. And virtually all who kill themselves are said to have been depressed. That's another thing. You know, if you want to write a suicide note, you have to be like, hey, look, buddy. Look, people listening, I am not freaking depressed. The first line of shit. I've already freaking done everything. I'm not depressed. The economy sucks. And just as people can have cancer and not know it, so they may have depression and not know it. Hence, need to be tested for it, lest it kill them. On the website of the Depression is Real Coalition, I understand what the freaking point is, but who are the people that are so adamant about this without qualifications, that aren't explicitly, they want to educate people? They should say that this is a qualification, this is a way of looking at it. Depression is an analogy for real. That would have been a much better movement. No, depression is really, really real. Okay? Indisputable. I mean, scientific evidence is, that's what the fuck scientific evidence is. It's something that's disputable. Otherwise, it's not science. Indisputable, fine scientific evidence shows depression. So this is why people don't believe in freaking global warming. People don't trust anything anymore. Indisputable scientific evidence shows depression to be biologically based disease that destroys the connection between brain cells. The Depression is Real campaign consists of television, radio, and print public services, PSAs, print and radio advertisements, websites, depressionisreal.org, okay, and other educational activities. Oh my god, I can't believe it's 2023 and we have to keep telling people that depression is real. The print and radio ads are science-based and featured Dr. Paul Greengard, winner of the 2000 Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine, and an expert in brain function and the mechanisms of depression. The Depression is Real Coalition is particularly concerned that depression is not widely recognized or taken seriously enough in the African American and Latino communities, which are already undeserved in many areas of healthcare. Underserved in many areas of healthcare. Latino communities, I want to say something again, right? These are all cancers within the English world. But all of these feminist psychologisms are cancers within the English world that are being spread and wrongly translated from German, from Freud, to becoming Hivemind idioms in English. And English, because, it's the British Empire, spreads its bullshit across the world. Why? Because it's the best. It's neoliberal colonialism, like we've been saying before. It's neoliberal colonialism of the mind. At the same time, the National Mental Health Association, there is such a thing as being in a long-term depressive state. I don't know if it helps to call it a disease. Sure, you can be in a long-term depressive state. Sure, we can see that everybody needs some psychological help because of the collective historical trauma that we live in. But we need to qualify everything. Qualify everything as a metaphor. But the problem is, a lot of these people who become psychologists have, I don't want to medicalize everything, but they are people, why did you become a psychologist in the first place? It's like to fix what's happening in my own brain, first of all. Depression affects over 19 million American adults, including college students. College nationwide, large percentage of college students are feeling overwhelmed, sad, hopeless, and so depressed that they are unable to function. According to recent National College Health Survey, 10% of college students who have been diagnosed with depression, women, are 5 times as likely to have anxiety disorders, eating disorders. 5 to 10 million women and 1 million men, the highest rates occurring in college-aged women. And this is what I'm thinking about, that clip of Finkelstein, of that woman who is crying about Finkelstein, talking about Palestine. He's like, no, I can't, you know what? I'm done with these crocodile tears. I'm done with people, using crocodile. These are crocodile tears, right? Like, we don't know about this, like the statistic. I don't know. Suicide was 8th leading cause of death for all Americans. Doctors have such a high rate of suicide. They have the best job. They have the best situation. But they're put on the front, search my definition for surplus emotional labor. Surplus emotional labor it affects the medical profession first. Surplus emotional labor. Or you can also search collective devaluation paradox. Both of my definitions on Urban Dictionary. More than 30. I like Urban Dictionary because it's just not PC. Americans, the 3rd leading cause of death for those aged 15 to 24, and the 2nd leading killer in the college population in 1998. More than 30% of college freshmen report feeling overwhelmed a great deal of the time. About 38% of college women report feeling frequently overwhelmed. Remember, the diagnosis lives a life of its own. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Cui bono? The answer is obvious. It's so obvious that the self-styled psychiatric educators never mention 2 major risks inherent in every professional contact between an individual and a psychiatrist, namely stigmatization by diagnosis. There we go. The diagnosis lives a life of its own, and loss of liberty by forced psychiatric hospitalization. Why do promoters of medicalization, that is psychiatric slavery, regularly fail to mention its potential downside? Because they benefit from it. Because they mendaciously regard psychiatric oppression of the patient as beneficial for that patient, much as the promoters of chattel slavery regarded oppression of slaves as beneficial for them. Oof, he uses much stronger words than me. Lincoln's answer to this outrage remains relevant. But slavery is good for some people. As good thing, slavery is strikingly peculiar in this sense that it is the only good thing which no man ever seeks the good of for himself. Let's go back to short-term videos, the short-circuiting videos, we call them. These guys, the social media gurus, they don't let their kids, or the Zuckerberg and stuff, they don't let their kids get addicted to short-form video. They give them books. I promise you. In short, medicalization is not medicine or science. It's a semantic social strategy that benefits some persons and harms others. There's no universalism. They create diagnostic, self-fulfilling prophecy. Igas Moniz, a Nobel laureate in medicine, lent his name and prestige to the worldwide iatrogenic plague for curing non-diseases by lobotomy, typically imposed on the subject against his will or without his consent. Sadly, now another Nobel laureate in medicine, Paul Greengard, lends his name and prestige to a new worldwide iatrogenic plague of curing non-diseases by chemotherapy, fraudulently or forcibly imposed on the subject. Any psychiatric campaign that deserves the name, quote, education, ought to begin by emphasizing the risks. That's called freaking philosophy. That's called qualifying your statements, like we've been saying. I mean, this basic shit, basic stuff, stepping over. Just like how in math, we don't teach proofs, first of all. The medical treatment of mental patients began with the infringement of their personal freedom. Karl Wernicke, pioneer of German neuropathologists. It still begins with the infringement of their personal freedom. That guy's a big guy. Wernicke. I can't believe we have to give a definition of metaphor here. That's how low we've gone. Let's go back. Metaphor, a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them. As in drowning in money. That's a good analogy. That's basically his argument here. Neoliberalism. About 20 years ago, in the 50s, I began to clarify what seemed to be the core problem of psychiatry, namely the nature of so-called mental illness. This led to a semantic scrutiny and refutation of the 2 fundamental claims of contemporary psychiatrists, that mental illnesses are genuine diseases and psychiatry is a bona fide medical specialty. It is impossible to undertake an analysis of the concept of illness without first coming to grips with the concept of ordinary or bodily illness. What do we mean when we say that a person is ill? We usually mean 2 quite different things. First, that he believes, or that his physician believes, or that they both believe believe that he suffers from an abnormality or malfunction of his body. And second, that he wants, or is at least willing to accept, medical help for his suffering. The term illness thus refers, first, to an abnormal biological condition whose existence may be claimed, truly or falsely, by patient, physician, or others. And second, to the social role of the patient, which may be assumed or assigned. If a person does not suffer from an abnormal biological condition, we do not consider him to be ill. We certainly do not let him to be physically ill. And if he does not voluntarily assume the role of a person who is sick, he is not usually considered to be a medical patient. That is because the practice of modern Western medicine rests on two tacit premises, namely, that the physician's task is to diagnose and treat disorders of the human body, and that he can carry out the services only with the consent of his patient. In other words, physicians are trained to treat bodily ills, not economic, moral, racial, religious, or political ills, and that they themselves, except psychiatrists, expect and in turn are expected by their patients to treat bodily diseases, not envy and rage, fear and folly, poverty and stupidity, and all other miseries that beset man. Strictly speaking, then, diseases or illnesses can affect only the body. Hence, there can be no such thing as mental illness. The term mental illness is a metaphor. Alright, so we're going to skip a little bit. Might makes the metaphor. South is dry and will vote dry. That is, everybody's sober enough to stagger to the polls will. Recently, 1973, I participated in one of those fashionable symposia in which a group of well-known, at least among their colleagues psychiatrists, reenact the drama of Babel. Each, in his own jargon, largely incomprehensible to others, set forth in utter seriousness the character, cause, and cure of mental illness. The meeting was heavy on biology, with elegant graphs and tables projected onto expensive screens demonstrating with irrefutable scientific evidence the genetic basis of alcoholism and antisocial personality. My presence at the occasion, I suppose, a symptom of schizophrenia now affecting the psychiatric establishment itself. I refer to the fact that the mental health professionals now display an equally intense interest in the view that mental illnesses are baffling brain diseases, and in the view that their diagnostic labels are malicious medical metaphors. I do not smoke and occasionally don't usually mind if others do. However, as I was coming down with the flu at the time of the meeting, my throat was dry and I was undoubtedly more sensitive than I might have otherwise been to what I was being exposed to, both through my ears and my nostrils. The intellectual fare was not my dish. However, I felt that my colleagues were entitled to their opinions and their smokes, I guess. What I felt they were not entitled to was to proclaim that alcoholism is genetically determined mental disease and at the same time produce vast quantities of smoke by steadily puffing cigars, cigarettes, and pipes. When my turn came to speak, I asked why, if alcoholism is a mental disease, is nicotinism also not a mental disease, and whether filling a room with tobacco smoke might not be viewed as an antisocial act by those who don't smoke. The response was a ripple of applause by a small contingent of non-smokers in the audience, and a rising wave of anger and clouds of smoke directed towards me by my colleagues. As the audience was composed mainly of psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, there's a figure of Freud with a pipe, right? There's an image of that. So since the audience was composed mainly of psychiatrists and other mental health officials, and since the members of these disciplines are especially fond of smoking, we non-smokers were greatly outnumbered. As to my fellow panelists, they evidently felt that my remark did not deserve to be taken seriously. They did not answer my question and continued to smoke. Might, Plato asserted, is right, thus offering one of the earliest and most often endorsed justifications of political justice. It's a debate in Plato, okay? Since medicine and especially psychiatry is now even more politicized than law, it is time that we realize that might is also the power to make medical metaphors. That's exactly what Hobbes talks about. Hobbes talks about the war of all against all guy. He talks about in the first part, okay, who has the power to make a definition? The person that has the power to make a definition is the guy. We need that is the state, basically. We need the state from a Hobbesian point of view. Because the state is the only thing that can clarify definitions, can clarify disagreements between definitions. Psychiatrists speak of alcoholism, regard it as a mental illness, and offer cures for it, but they do not speak of nicotinism and do not regard it as a disease. Indeed, there is now a Washington suburb, a much ballyhooed National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and there is no National Institute of Nicotine Abuse and Nicotinism. In fact, a lot of these psychologists, were working with the nicotine industry to get everybody addicted to the cigarettes. Isn't this because psychiatrists disapprove of alcoholism but approve of, indeed encourage nicotinism by the most potent means of moral teaching in the world, namely example? Sure, but they also it's even more potent than that because they actually go out and try to make the campaigns. I submit that and look at marketing, right? I'm going to go back to my point about TikTok and all this stuff. Those are who creates this medium. The medium is the message. It's through their studies. I submit that this inconsistency provides more insight into an understanding of what psychiatrists really mean by mental illness than fakery and foolishness they now foist on the public under the guise of discoveries into the genetic causes of chemical cures for this illness. Diagnosis, from description to prescription. To require medicine, said I, not merely for wounds on the incidence of some seasonal maladies, but because of sloth, and compel the ingenious sons of Asclepius to invent for diseases such names and fluxes as flatulences. Now, don't you think that's disgraceful? Guys, all of this shit has already been talked about in Plato. Nothing is new. We say that in philosophy all the time. We need philosophical education. You can't be a psychologist without having a BA in philosophy. That's one of my theses here. Nosology, the scientific classification of diseases, is less than 200 years old. It began with physicians dissecting corpses, comparing the abnormal organs of persons who died of diseases with the normal organs of persons who died in accidents or as a result of violence. And it was put on a scientific physical chemical foundation by the German pathologist Rudolf Virchow, whose definition of disease as a disturbance in the structure or functions of the cells, tissues, and organs became the basics for classical nosology. Until recently, the pathologist's diagnosis, which always trumped the clinician's, was considered to be the correct name of the disease that ailed or killed the patient. However, post-war developments in medical technology and the provision of healthcare services shifted the focus from nosology from post-mortem to antemortem diagnosis, and from the patient's body, the body politic. Again, let's go back to my Agamben video, the body politic. Watch my Carrying Over the Burdens of Trace series, Ritual Trace series. The scientific diagnosis of live patients is, for the most part, a recent technological development. First diagnostic method, percussion, was discovered in 1761 by Leopold Oppenberger, the son of an innkeeper of Graz, Austria. As a youngster, he learned to tap caskets of wine to determine the quantity of liquid in the container and apply the technique to the human chest. The systematic measurement of body temperature dates from 1852. The sphygmometer was invented in 1896. The more sophisticated tests used today are all 20th century development. Today, the identification of bodily abnormalities in living persons making use of any array of sophisticated tools is a highly developed science. The making of clinical diagnosis, that is, identifying the lesion or disease, if there is one, to account for a living person's / patient's complaints / symptoms, is a technical routine requiring a standardized interpretation. 50 years ago, some physicians were sought after because they were known as great diagnosticians. Today, there are no great diagnosticians. The sought after physicians are now great therapists, typically virtuoso surgeons or wizards of psychopharmacology. Classic Virchowian nosology was the province of pathologists, the experts of the post-mortem examination of cadavers. In contrast, contemporary clinical nosology in the province partly of the medical administrator and the expert on diagnosis-related groups, DRGs, and partly of the medical political activists, the expert on the cost and consequences of behaviors deemed to be diseases and of procedures deemed to be therapies. The shift from nosological focus from the human body to the body economic and the body politic is but one symptom of the pervasive politicization of medicine, redefined as the delivery of healthcare. Reviewing the changing criteria for diagnosis, Yale pathologist R. Fernstein emphasizes divergences among three systems: International Classification of Diseases, ICD, the Problem-Oriented Record, POR, and the Diagnosis-Related Group, DRG, and states, after magnificent scientific advancements in etiological explanation and therapeutic intervention during the 20th century, clinical medical medicine seems ready to enter the 20th century with fundamental scientific defect in one of its oldest, most basic activities, the system used to identify and classify diseases. The problem to which Feinstein points is not a scientific imperfection, but a moral deficit. Current disease taxonomies are not intended to be, and often do not even pretend to be, scientific, that is descriptive. Instead, they are political, that is prescriptive. The personal is not political. Ongoing theme here from Hannah Arendt going. Their goal is not to identify bodily conditions that ought to be considered diseases, but to create social policies such as permitting and recommending the use of certain chemicals as safe and effective therapeutic agents. And have they been successful at that with all this forever chemicals that we're talking about? So even if the stuff that they want to do, and prohibiting and punishing the use of others as medically worthless drugs of abuse. Which are the most abused drugs? They're drugs of pharmaceutical industries. A physician cogently observes the greatest dangers with DRGs may result from linking monetary gain to the classification system, an idea supported by the current literature. Neoliberal science. In my view, the new nosologies pose a much graver threat. By validating the politicization of medicine, they remove the last barriers against the medicalization of unwanted behaviors, and thus pave the way for unopened and unopposable rule of the therapeutic state. Read Agamben. The biopolitics and neoliberalism. Consider the following examples. November 1993, a group of investigators supported in part by the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company estimated that the annual cause of depression in the United States was totally 43.7 billion. That's an old reference. Mental health advocates frequently cite this figure and others like it as if it's proved that depression is a disease. For instance, Tipper Gore, mental health advisor to Bill Clinton, asserts that depression alone costs society 43.7 billion annually. Watch my video on scientism. Lithium, it's in my Carrying Over the Rituals of Trace series. Lithium has saved the economy billions of dollars over the past 2 decades. Clozapine now allows many of the most seriously ill to live their lives productively. Psychiatrist Jose Santiago explains, depression is an illness that merits urgent attention by healthcare policy reformers as its costs to society are considerable. You see these neoliberal classifications, the neoliberal, circular logic. That's how you know it's a frickin' religion. It's neoliberalism in, neoliberalism out. Garbage in, garbage out, as the great Adolf Reed says. Actually, that's an old idiom, even that's older than him, but he uses it. Talk about intersectionality. The view that certain chemicals enhance productivity is hardly a new idea. South American Indians have long chewed cocoa leaves for this reason. Freud felt that smoking enabled him to be more creative. He did not claim, however, that the beneficial effect of nicotine is evidence that the smoker suffers from a disease for which nicotine is a treatment. So things are getting worse. That's the point of the last video, Wittgenstein. Basing this claim for the disease status for depression and schizophrenia on the subject's allegedly favorable response to drugs rests on precisely that logic. If giving a particular drug is authoritatively classified as a treatment, the subject as a patient, and his post-treatment behaviors as an improvement, then ipso facto, the diseases that he had was a bona fide disease. Thus, has response to treatment become one of our diagnostic criteria? I'm just thinking about all these old people that I know have to take so many different, I don't know. I'm not a medical doctor. The logic is circular. Exactly, I just said that. The logic is freaking circular. The popularity of Prozac is evidence that depression is common. The FDA approval of this drug and of other so-called antidepressants prove that depression is a disease. The absence of objective criteria for diagnostic depression, there is heated debate about who should take antidepressant drugs. I'm just going to pray for Thomas Szasz for a second. Thank you, Mr. Szasz, for all your work trying to save the humanity from its own bullshit. Here is a politically correct answer to this question. Unlike, say, high cholesterol levels, which show up in laboratory tests, the diagnosis of depression is often subjective. What do you see as a criteria? Maybe an individual is not clinically depressed, but he or she still feels depressed and goes to the physician 15 times a year and misses 30 days of work. If the individual takes the drug and doesn't go to the physician and doesn't miss any work, the benefit to the total healthcare cost would be there. In a similar vein, the New York Times informs us at least 11 million Americans have a bout of depression every year, and only about 30% currently get medicalization medication that could help them. Many millions more whose symptoms don't amount to clinical depression might also look at drugs. The adjective, quote, clinical, is a code word justifying drug treatment and, if need be, involuntary psychiatric intervention. The fact that not a single textbook of pathology recognizes depression and schizophrenia as diseases has not in the least dampened popular and political enthusiasm for their diagnoses and treatments. Definitely much different these days, Mr. Szasz. Tipper Gore insists that antidepressants such as Prozac has been developed for the treatment of diagnosable mental illnesses, not the casual pursuit of happiness. The term diagnosable is here a code that means government approved and insurance reimbursable. Gore's protest is superfluous. As everyone knows, the pursuit of happiness by means of government disapproved drugs is now punished more severely than violent crime. The minimum penalty imposed by U.S. federal law for attempted murder with harm is 6.5 years. For possession of LSD is 10 years. In addition, possessing an illegal drug is presumptive evidence of using it, being addicted to it, and hence having a disease as well. That's definitely what's going on, and that's not ended. Defining the use of drugs disapproved by the state as a disease and the use of drugs approved by the state as a treatment illustrates the radical politicization of both nosology and therapy. If the government validates a drug, bestowing on it FDA approval for the treatment of, say, X, and ipso facto, X is accepted as a disease. For example, attention hyperactivity disorder. Oh my god, so many children have been drugged because of it. Clinical depression, panic attack. In other words, if there is a drug to treat it, it must be a disease. Circular logic. The whole freaking thing is circular logic. That's how you know it's ideology. Pure ideology, as Zizek would say. Illustrative is the report of Johnson & Johnson. Oh, we all trust Johnson & Johnson, that's for sure. Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical Company having won federal approval for its schizophrenia drug Risperdal, which has caused a stir among doctors and patients seeking new treatments for one of the most devastating and expensive of all diseases. The disease costs $33 billion annually. Oh man. Brandishing such enormous costs makes it a taboo to question whether schizophrenia is a disease and whether psychotic drugs help patients. At the same time, the dogmatic view that mental disease are brain diseases treatable with chemicals dehumanizes and denominated individuals diagnosed schizophrenic and their behavior disappear into a fog of literalized metaphors. Hive mind idioms built on hive mind idioms. Haven't I been talking about that? One psychiatrist, I mean, this is in psychology. This is in our everyday conversations that have the bleeding of all of these expertise into our everyday lives, creating self-fulfilling prophecies. One psychiatrist who studied Risperdal explained how research found it treated schizophrenia's delusions better than Haldol, one of the most widely used psychotic drugs. Who cares that schizophrenia cannot have delusions? That having delusions is not like having a diabetes, because the observer calls, quote, delusion, quote, the subject calls belief. The anti-schizophrenia drugs eagerly embraced by the patient's familial and psychiatric adversaries are regularly rejected by the patients whose suffering they allegedly relieve. Declared Laurie Philid of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, this new drug means a whole new group of people will have an opportunity to return to productive life. Who cares whether this is a serious forecast past or a self-serving exaggeration. Before World War II, few diseases were treatable, but nosology was an honest enterprise. Now many diseases are treatable, but nosology is dishonest enterprise. The old nosology, whose aims were empirical validity and scientific respectability, was unconcerned with the treatment of diseases. The new nosology, whose aim are political favor and professional profit, rests on arrogant claims about treatability as a criterion for illness. Virchowian nosology was an offspring of 19th century science and the free market. Except for psychiatry and public health, medicine was then economically and politically independent of the state. Today, the definition of disease and treatment are controlled by monopolistic alliance of medicine and the state. Healthcare is viewed as an entitlement. Physicians endorsing neuromythological fantasies are about mental illnesses. Join the mindless political chatter about non-existent market forces in medicine. In short, we are in the process of replacing the classical process of, we've already past the cyberpunk dystopias, replacing the classical empirical pathological criteria of disease with a new political economic criteria of it. The personal is not political, bitches. Currently, nosology no longer encodes the objectively verifiable conditions of patients' bodies. Instead, it reflects the attitudes of their families and societies to their idleness, lack of productivity, independence, and their families' justifications for the interventions they want politicians to legitimize, and psychiatrists to impose on them as therapy. Diagnoses are not diseases. Learn to recognize the symptoms of mental illness. Schizophrenia, manic depression, and severe depression are brain diseases. This is the Hivemind idiom, right? I can't believe it's 1991 and we have to tell everybody. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association, the fucking APA, the American Psychological Association, this is the psychiatric one, published the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, DSM-3. Oi. I should just make a whole freaking video about the DSM. This document was celebrated for its deletion of homosexuality from the list of mental disorders and was hailed as a symbol of the new medical psychiatry. But they didn't learn anything. Psychiatry. Yet, only 3 years later, ostensibly because data were emerging from new studies that were inconsistent with some of the diagnostic criteria, the APA embarked on a revision of DSM-3. The DSM is the most political freaking thing there is. In 1987, DSM-3R was published. A year later, the Board of Trustees of the APA appointed a task force to prepare DSM-4. In 1991, the APA, and the DSM-5 is the most evil one. DSM published, because I have higher standards, right? The DSM-4 options book, work in progress. More than ever, the profession of psychiatry is determined to ground its medical legitimacy on creating diagnoses and pretending they are diseases. More and more scientism. Intrigued by the patently metaphoric character of the psychiatric vocabulary, which nevertheless is widely recognized and validated as legitimate medical idiom, I decided at the very beginning of my professional career to explore the nature and function of these literalized metaphors and to expose them as metaphors to the light of public scrutiny. It's so crazy. I took it upon my profession to point out what is freaking obvious. I thus set in motion a controversy about mental illnesses that is still raging and whose crux is still often misunderstood because people don't understand what the fuck a metaphor is. Scientists, jurists, mental health professions, and lay people alike seem to believe that the demonstration of genetic defect said to be causing a mental illness, for example, alcoholism, or a lesion in the brain of the mental patients, for example, schizophrenics, would prove or has already proved that mental illness exists and are like other illnesses. This is not so. If mental illnesses are diseases of the central nervous system, for example, paresis, then they are diseases of the brain, not of the mind. And if mental illnesses are names of misbehaviors, for example, fear and avoidance of narrow spaces called claustrophobia, then they are behaviors, not diseases. A screwdriver may be a drink or an implement. No amount of research on orange juice and vodka can establish that it is hitherto unrecognized form of carpenter's tool. Although such linguistic clarification is useful for individuals who want to think clearly, it is not useful for social institutions resting on the unexamined literal use of their master metaphors. Exactly. Okay? The metaphors are not bad by themselves. It's that they create a life of their own. It's called social reproduction, or self-fulfilling prophecy. Accordingly, I have long maintained that psychiatric metaphors play the same role in our therapeutic society that religious metaphors that have played and continue to play in theological societies. Man, this guy gets it. This guy gets ideology. For example, both Christianity and Islam affirm the existence of life after death, and many people say they believe in such a life. The fact that many more Americans believe in the existence of heaven and in the existence of hell tells us more, of course, about Americans than about life after death. However, if we use the term life to denote biological lives of human being, then, literally speaking, life is a process that has a beginning, called conception or birth, and an end, called death. The phrase life after death is therefore an oxymoron, a metaphor. Still, if a person that believes in life after death, his conviction is not likely to be dispelled by pointing this out to him, because the idea, it works even if you don't believe in it, and because you cannot prove there is nothing after death. As true believers put it, those who believe in life after death and those who do not have nothing more to say to each other on the subject. The same goes for the colloquy between those who believe in mental illnesses and those who do not. While there is a large common ground between the image of heaven and hell and sanity and insanity, there is also a difference between them that must be noted. For any living person, his own death, by definition, a future event. In this sense, it is true that none of us can know what will happen to him after he dies. On the other hand, the term mental health and mental illness refers to behaviors displayed in living human beings, and we know perfectly well what these terms signify. So he's saying the same point I've been making, right? That theology makes even more sense than this. That the war between, Scientology makes more sense than freaking philosophy, or that makes more sense than psychology. I defend Scientology. It makes more sense. And look at what's going on Twitter with regards to people, these psychologists attacking Scientology. I mean, I'm not defending Scientology here. I'm just making that point. And we know perfectly well what these terms signify: approved and disapproved, legitimate and illegitimate ways of life before death. Thus, every one of us makes certain basic choices. For example, either we accept that life is finite and ends in death, or we reject this view and embrace the belief in a life after death. Similarly, either we accept life as an unceasing struggle for meaning, legitimacy, and other values that inexorably bring people into conflict with others and themselves, and in which individuals can succeed or fail. Or we reject this view and believe that there is a mentally healthy state, that attainment of which would eliminate human strife and personal failure. That's it, right? I mean, realizing, that's what I've said before. Realizing mental health is realizing that there's parts of you that will never heal. There's parts of society that will never heal. And once you reach that point, I think that's what healing is. Religion is, among other things, the institutionalized denial of the finiteness of life. Individuals who want to reject the reality of death can thus theologize life and entrust its management to clerical professionals. Similarly, psychiatry is, among other things, institutional denial of the tragic nature of life. And that's why he talks about the psychologization of Shakespeare. Individuals who want to reject the reality of free will and responsibility can thus medicalize life and entrust its management to health professionals. That's scary. That's what we're talking about before. Agamben, biopolitics. Marx was close to the mark when he asserted that religion is the opiate of the people. But religion is not the opiate of the people. The human mind is. After all, religion is a product of our own minds, and so too is psychiatry. In short, the mind is its own opiate, and its ultimate drug is the word. Wow, what a great reworking. The mind is its own opiate, and its ultimate drug is the word. Despite such considerations, an editorial of the prestigious British medical journal Lancet remains fixed on the mirage of finding the cause of schizophrenia, like that of paresis in the brain, lamenting the state of psychiatry 150 years after the founding of the British Association of Medical Officers, Asylum and Hospitals for the Insane, which after some intermediary name changes became in 1971 the Royal College of Psychiatry. Editorial writer states, "What about psychiatric research? We seem to be no closer to finding the real presumed biological causes of the major psychiatric illness. This is not to decry the value of such research if the causes of of conditions such as schizophrenia are found, it will be an advance of the same magnitude as the identification of syphilis spirochete in the brains of patients with general paralysis of the insane. As I mentioned, I took up the profession of psychiatry in part to debunk the biological reductionist impulse that motivated its origin and that continues to fuel its engine. In other words, to combat the contention and refute the expectation that abnormal behaviors must be understood as products of abnormal brains. Ironically, it was easier to do this then, more than 60 years ago, than today. For the better part, because of all this publish or die bullshit, for this academic inflation, extreme scientism, for the better part of the three, and all of these things are going to be used to control us. That's the problem, right? Ironically, that's what Agamben says. I mean, the arrogance of it all, the way that they talk about, and the liberal arrogance. I'm liberal. I'm supposed to be a freaking liberal. For the better part of the 3 centuries, the idea that every phenomenon named a mental illness will prove to be a bona fide brain disease was a hypothesis that could be supported or opposed. However, after the 60s, this hypothesis became increasingly accepted as a scientific fact, like the spherical shape of the Earth. And funny, because the Earth it's not very smooth. I'm thinking of Neil deGrasse Tyson clip. Of course, it is still physically possible and legally permissible to say that mental illnesses do not exist. But since only a charlatan, a fool, for fanatic disputes facts or opposes science, such as a critic is likely to be dismissed as irrational or worse. And these are the people that decide who is crazy and who is not. Thus, for the moment at least, psychiatrists, so you have to have a freaking psychiatry degree to, okay. Thus, for the moment at least, psychiatrists and their powerful allies, psychologists, have seemingly succeeded in persuading the scientific community, the courts, the media, and the general public, and all the other faculties that the condition they call mental disorders are diseases. That is to say, phenomena independent of human motivation or will. This is a curious development. It's neoliberal. It's neoliberal colonialism. It's a curious development. For until recently, only psychiatrists who know little about medicine and less about science embrace such blind physical reductionism. Most scientists knew better. It's a curious development. Academic inflation, neoliberal science. Michael Polanyi's remarks in his essay entitled Life's Irreducible Structures are illustrative. In 68, he wrote, "We can see that though rooted in the body, the mind is free in its actions, exactly as our common sense knows it to be free. The mind harnesses neurophysiological mechanisms. Though it depends on them, it is not determined by them." Anticipating already then that such a view would expose him to accusations of being anti-scientific, Polanyi went on to re-emphasize that the mark of the true scientist is not making grandiose theoretical claims or flamboyant promises of impending therapeutic triumphs, something that's a freaking regularity in neoliberal science today, but accepting, and what was it, that crazy lady who had the blood machine? I can't remember her name, and then she had it turned out the machine didn't work at all, but accepting limits and building on the possible. Neoliberal science, neoliberal marketing, the recognition of certain basic impossibilities has laid the foundations of some major principles of physics and chemistry. Similarly, recognition, there's no humility. That's why we have to fucking be arrogant at the arrogant structure. Similarly, recognition of the impossibility of understanding living things in terms of physics and chemistry, far from setting limits to our understanding of life, will guide it in the right direction. Thinking of a joke here. Joke is a chemist, a biologist, and a physician, or physics guy, go into a bar. There they meet a horse race guy. And the horse race guy says, "How can I go faster?" So the 3 scientists, they go home, they say, "Give us some time and we're going to come back to you and give you an answer." The biologist goes home, comes back in a week, and says, "Hey, do this exercises and do these treatments and your horse will go fast." The chemist comes back in a month and says, do this, and try these drugs and maybe the horse will go fast. They can't find the physics guy for a year. He's like, "We gotta go find the physics guy." They finally find him. His beard is really big. It's a year later, and they're like, "Hey, what happened to you? What happened to the horse?" And the physics guy goes, "The horse? I've been working on a line going around a circle for about a year." That's what science used to be. Used to be so many qualifications. By the time he, draws a freaking whole horse that goes comes around, it takes forever. It is not by accident that the more firmly psychiatrically inspired ideas take hold of the collective American mind, the more foolishness and injustice they generate. Again, we're talking about psychiatry here. We're not even talking about psychology. The specifications of the American Disabilities Act, ADA, a federal law in 1990, is a case in point. The official aim of the law is to diminish the stigma of mental illness and reduce... Oh my god, every time you hear diminish the stigma of something, you know that something bad is about to happen. Defund academia. That's the only freaking solution to this. Hashtag defund academia. And reduce discrimination involving at least 60 million Americans between the age of 18 and 64. Pill shaming, slut shaming, all this crap. Who will experience a mental disorder in this lifetime? If this is the politically and psychiatrically correct view, how can I maintain that there are no mental disorders? Not very easily. But then, Will Rogers can be summoned for help. Compared to those fellows in Congress, he wrote, I'm just an amateur. Every time they make a joke, it's a law. And every time they make a law, it's a joke. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a law, but that does not prevent it from being a joke. A very bad one at that. Long ago, our lawmakers acquiesced. These are the same lawmakers who invest before they make a law, who invest in the stock market before they make neoliberal corruption. Long ago, our lawmakers acquiesced in letting psychiatrists literalize and the metaphor of mental illness. Having accepted fictitious mental diseases as facts, they now had to identify which of these manufactured maladies were covered and which were not. Under the ADA, they had no trouble doing so, creating a veritable DSM Congress, that is, a list of congressionally accredited mental diseases. Thus, the ADA covers claustrophobia, personality problems, and mental retardation, but does not cover kleptomania, pyromania, and compulsive gambling, and transvestism. Well, at least Congress agrees with me that stealing, setting fires, and gambling and cross-dressing are not diseases. But it is positively comical that our senators and congressmen do not realize that they have no more ground for excluding these alleged disorders from the ADA coverage than they have for including those that they accept for the coverage. At the same time, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal published major reports, The New Deal for the Mentally Ill, published feature article on kleptomania. In keeping with DSM-3R, the author's premise was that kleptomania is a bona fide illness. It's a task. I remember this. It's like a 90s. And then they had like friends make jokes about it and stuff. It bleeds into the public imagination too, in pop culture. His task was simply to explore the document, its insistence, character, and cause. People who respect authority easily consume this shit. Respect authority for the sake of respecting authority, not because it's earned. Not surprisingly, the author's principal conclusion was to propose a biopsychosocial model of the etiology of kleptomania that emphasizes possible childhood abuse as a precipitating factor. Isn't that a factor for every issue? Perhaps I should add here that the APA recognizes claustrophobia as mental disorders and kleptomania as mental disorders on exact same footing. So the claustrophobia, which the ADA accepts as a mental illness, and kleptomania, which the ADA rejects as mental disorders, on the exact same footing. It is not my intention to discuss here what we mean by the word disease. However, apropos the ADA and its exclusion of kleptomania, I want to note that as normal users of English, we do not attribute motives to diseases and do not call motivated actions bodily diseases. For example, we attribute no motive to a person for having leukemia. It would be foolish to say the particular motive led a person to having glaucoma. And it would be quite nonsensical to assert that an illness, say diabetes, caused a person to become a senator. In short, one of the most important philosophical political features of the concept of mental illness, at one fell swoop, it removes motivation from action, adds it to illness, and thus destroys the very possibility of separating disease from non-disease. This crucial function of the idea of mental illness is dramatically illustrated by the psychiatrist's definition of certain acts of stealing as a disease, kleptomania, by the media's acceptance of this behavior as a disease, even when the act called shoplifting and by the mental health professional's explanation of the causes that allegedly result in this disease. In a news report on shoplifting as a disease, the director of Onondaga country's drinking and driving program explained, Syracuse needs Shoplifters Anonymous. There are more than 3,000 arrests for shoplifting in Onondaga County. It's costing everyone a fortune! Although the program is described as voluntary, it is in fact a substitute for a criminal penalty. If the thief completes the course, the arrest vanishes from his or her record. The report illustrates that experts and media alike treat shoplifting as a disease to which they nevertheless then attribute various motives. In this treatment program, the shoplifters learn why they steal. There are several reasons why people shop. They feel entitled. Perhaps they feel prices are too high, and they are angry at authority. You see? It's a mental health problem. Another article a few days later was devoted to explaining shoplifting addiction, which was defined as a situation where a person may utilize shoplifting as an activity to change their mood. Such a person really doesn't like shoplifting. It's not a free experience because it has a very driven quality to it. Experts cited do not even pretend to present pathological evidence to support their claim, anatomic or physiological. Instead, they drop names like famous addicted shoppers, Princess Diana, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, she's like everywhere. Imelda Marcos, ostensibly as proof that shopaholism is disease. Is addiction to shopping treatable? The reporter inquires. Yes, but with variables, say the experts. The treatment is very much like any other addiction. You have to look at it as a lifelong process. Okay, Bono? Although Congress, again, it's all just circular logic. Oi, 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 oi. Although Congress has so far remained unconvinced that the behavior we call shoplifting, but psychiatrists call kleptomania, is an illness, it might be of interest to list here a few of their behaviors for which psychiatrists have disease names and that the ADA implicitly accept as bona fide diseases on equal footing with, say, malaria and melanoma. 370. Body dysmorphic disorder. Dysmorphobia. The essential feature of this disorder is preoccupation with some imagined defect appearance in normal appearing person. 314. Multiple personality disorder. The essential feature of this disorder is the existence within the person of two or more distinct personalities. Like all politicians don't freaking have that. At least two of these personalities at some time recurrently take full control of the person's behavior. 302-89. Fraudteurism. The essential feature of this is recurrent, intense sexual urges, sexual arousing fantasies, at least 6 months during duration, involving touching and rubbing against a non-consenting person. Hypoactive sexual desire disorder. Persistently or recurrently deficient or absent sexual fantasies and desire for sexual activity. The judgment of deficiency or absence is made by the clinician. I feel like we're living in the Dark Ages or something. Factitious disorder with physical symptoms. The essential feature of this disorder is the intentional production of physical symptoms. The presentation may be totally fabrication, as in complaints of acute abdominal pain in the absence of such. The political and popular acceptance of such similar psychiatric words and phrases generates a steady stream of absurd situations. Nevertheless, we regard psychiatric disposition humane and useful. Neither the erroneous nature of psychiatric premises nor the injustices of psychiatric dispositions discredits psychiatry as a medical specialty. Consider the following story: a typical of what now passes as psychiatric explanation and legal judgment. A 42-year-old female orthopedic surgeon working in Virginia suburbs of DC is arrested for drunken driving. She resists arrest, refuses to take a breath or blood test, curses and kicks the police. Taken into custody, she finally consents to take a breath test and registers 0.13 over 0.1 legal limits. At trial, she maintained that the circumstances of her behavior at the time of her arrest were a result of PMS. She was acquitted. In reporting the story in Psychiatric News, the American Psychiatric Association bi-weekly newspaper, the writer asked, does LLPD, late phase dysphoric disorder, luteal phase dysphoric disorder, the same question might be raised, of course, about every non-bodily disease. The reporter then cites the comments of several psychiatrists that illustrate dramatically psychiatry's intellectual bankruptcy and moral desolation. The decision as to whether or not LLPDD will be assigned its own diagnostic category in the 4th edition of the APA's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, DSM-4, is a political landmine, according to Alan Francis, MD, chair of the task force on the DSM-4. David Rubino, MD, a psychiatrist who has done research at NIH on PMS for more than a decade, offered his opinion. As far as I'm concerned, the decision to include PMS in DSM-4 will be made on political rather than medical consideration. It's clear that there are a substantial number of people with PMS who never get arrested. To attribute guilt to a crime to PMS is somewhat hazardous enterprise. Precisely the same argument can be made about any mental illness used to support an insanity defense. John Hinckley Jr. was acquitted of shooting the President Reagan because psychiatrists testified he had schizophrenia. But how many people diagnosed as schizophrenic shoot a president? And of those who do, how many claim they did it to impress Jodie Foster? Actually, Hinckley's act was a unique performance that in some ways may be more revealing of the actor's character than his ordinary behaviors performed routinely. Psychiatrists deny this, as indeed they must, because they realize that their entire enterprise hinges on society's acceptance of the proposition that human beings diagnosed as mentally ill have a brain disease that deprives them of their free will. I have offered these reflections in a further effort to clarify the crucial differences between disease and diagnosis. Disease, the old-fashioned literal sense of the term, occur naturally, like avalanches or earthquakes, whereas diagnoses are man-made artifacts or constructs, like books or bridges, which raises the question, why do we make diagnoses? We have several reasons for doing so. 1. Scientific, to identify the organs or tissues affected, perhaps the causes of the ill. 2. Professional, to enlarge the scope and thus the power and prestige of state-protected medical monopoly and the income of practitioners. 3. Legal, justify state-sanctioned coercive interventions outside the criminal justice. 4. Political economic, to justify enacting enforcing measures aimed at promoting public health and providing funds for research and treatment on projects classified as medical. 5. Personal, to enlist the support of public opinion, the media, and the legal system for bestowing special privileges and impose special hardships on persons diagnosed as mentally ill. It is not by coincidence that most psychiatric diseases are 20th century inventions. The aim of the classical 19th century model of diagnosis was to identify bodily lesions and their material causes, etiology. For example, the term pneumococcal pneumonia identifies the organ affected the lungs and the cause of the illness. Infection with pneumococcus. Pneumococcal pneumonia is an example of pathology-driven diagnosis. Diagnosis driven by other motives such as the desire to coerce the patient or to secure government funding for the treatment of illness generate different diagnostic constructions and lead to different conceptions of disease. Today, of course, these diagnoses of what used to be strictly medical diseases are no longer principally pathologically driven. Because of the third-party funding of hospital costs and physician fees, even the diagnosis of persons suffering from bona fide illnesses, for example, asthma and arthritis, are utterly distorted by economic consideration. In fact, final diagnoses on the discharge summaries of hospitalized patients are often no longer made by physicians, but by bureaucrats skilled in the ways of Medicare, Medicaid, and private health insurance reimbursement. Watch Dr. Shiva's video on this. Dr. Shiva is a presidential candidate and he's always pissed off. Based partly on what ails the patient and partly on what medical terms for his ailment and treatment ensure the most generous reimbursement for the services rendered to him. As for psychiatry, it ought to be clear that, except for the diagnosis of neurological diseases, which are treated by neurologists, no psychiatric diagnosis is or can be pathologically driven. Instead, such all diagnoses are driven by non-medical, that is, economic, personal, legal, politician, and social considerations or incentives. Accordingly, psychiatric diagnoses point neither to patho-anatomic or pathophysiological lesions, nor to diseases causative agents, but to human behaviors and human problems. It's a freaking political move, and to the fallible attempts of fallible moral agents to cope with problematic human beings. I'm just so happy that somebody wrote. Thank you, Thomas Szasz. The existential identity thieves. Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over and the tale has had its effect. Jonathan Swift, The Examiner. One of the most basic functions of living organisms is avoiding danger. In human beings, the emotion of fear serves that function. That's it. Insatiable insecurity. Because feeling fear is unpleasant, we try to escape it by seeking protection from danger, by looking to authorities, typically by looking to a protector. Tragically, this longing, be it a deity, a demagogue, a dictator, or a doctor, is itself a source of danger. Necessity, William Pitt famously remarked, is the plea for every infringement of human life. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. Perfect, right? This is an insatiable insecurity is the engine of neoliberalism. Fear of the insane and the psychiatrist's role as a society's protector from the risk someone to describe allegedly poses is what made. Look at this. Do you see what's going on here? The convergence between pill shaming and slut shaming happening here. The risk someone so described allegedly poses is what has made the mere ascription of the label insane a justification for depriving the bearer of liberty. Although the idea of dangerous madman is a bugaboo or a tautology, it's all tautology, it's all circular logic, because we redefine bad as mad, deviant as deranged. It has captivated, and we redefine solidarity as prostitution. It has captivated the contemporary mind, secular and religious alike. Perfect. That's what ideology is, and has entrapped some of the most admired modern intellectuals. Hashtag defund academia. In a history of Western philosophy, Bertrand Russell, the great atheist skeptic, tried to refute David Hume's skeptical empiricism and concluded that he was unequal to the task. Wonderful. It is therefore important to discover whether there is any answer to Hume within the framework of philosophy that is wholly or mainly empirical. If not, there is no intellectual difference between sanity and insanity. The lunatic who believes that he is a poached egg be condemned solely on the ground that he is in a minority, or rather, since we must not assume democracy, on the ground that the government does not agree with him. This is a desperate point of view, and it must be hoped that there is some way of escaping from it. Russell's desperation was inconsistent with his skepticism, expressed earlier in his skeptical essays, where he had stated, "I wish to propose for the reader's favorable consideration of a doctrine that is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground whatever for supposing it true." See, it's so great when you have a psychiatrist or psychologist who actually trained in philosophy. I've met psychologists who don't know what Kafka is, and I thought it was the most Kafkaesque thing. Russell was skeptical about religion, but not about psychiatry. Positing the existence of a lunatic who believes that he is a poached egg is a perfect example of believing a proposition when there is no ground whatever for supposing it to be true. Staple Lewis, the celebrated Christian apologist, believed in a religion, but disbelieved in psychiatry. Nevertheless, in his famous Dilemma, too, used the imaginary poached egg man to support his reason for believing in the divinity of Jesus. I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be a god. Quote. A lot of Islamic people say that. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who has merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic on level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this was a man and is the son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, and you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. The model lunatic, as a person who believes himself to be a poached egg, evidently was fashionable among 20th century academics, at least at Oxbridge. Let us scrutinize this modern psychiatric miracle. In a debate unrelated to the matters psychiatric, psychiatric. Russell, the hard-headed empiricist, would emphasize that we have no way of knowing what a person believes himself to be. I never really liked Bertrand Russell. Let's see what happens. We can now only know what he tells us about who or what he is. Have no grounds for treating him as his claim as a priori true. In ordinary English, as well as in the idiom of psychiatry, we call a person's claim that he is a poached egg a delusion. I have seen many persons with so-called delusions and have read many more, but have never seen or read of a poached egg man. In 19th century Europe asylums, the most popular delusion was being Napoleon, and modern American mental hospitals it's being Jesus. Whether or not the speaker believes his delusion is to be true is irrelevant. Simplest, most parsimonious explanation for his speech act is that he is lying. In his skeptical essays, Russell himself suggests this interpretation. He wrote, "A man who suffered from some humiliation invents a theory that he is a king of England and develops all kinds of ingenious explanations for the fact that he is not treated with respect which his exalted position demands. In this case, his delusion is one with which his neighbors do not sympathize, so they lock him up. But if instead of asserting only his own greatness, he asserts that the greatness of his nation or his class or his creed, he wins hosts of adherents and becomes a political or religious leader. People often pretend or claim to be someone they are not. When they do this on a public stage, we call him act. When they impersonate another for economic gain, defrauding others in the process, we call it identity theft. We treat them as criminals guilty of committing fraud, not as lunatics harboring beliefs. When, however, an individual, this is not a point say that he is this or that. He's just marking out the inconsistency. When, however, an individual impersonates Jesus, we refuse to see the self-evident method of his madness, the desire to gain existential rather than economic advantage, and dismissal of his conduct as meaningless delusion. I submit that we ought to view such behavior as a typical existential identity theft phenomenon that presents no particular challenge to either philosophy or theology. Yet Russell and Lewis both regard the existential identity theft as presenting the grandest philosophical and theological problem. Russell spoke of it as a desperate point of view, and it must be hoped there is some way of escaping from it. Lewis declared, either this man was and is a son of God, or else a madman or something worse. There is an obvious third choice. Take the third pill. What Zizek says with regards to ideology. The man who says he is the poached egg is a liar, and that ought to be the end of the matter for theology, philosophy, and psychiatry alike. If we prefer to cast Lewis's riddle in softer terms, we might say that the man in Nazareth 2,000 years ago who said he is the Son of God was a God-obsessed Jew using a figurative language fashionable at the time, expressing and conveying a meaning to himself and others, the exact signification of which we have no way of recapturing. Much as I admire Lewis, the man, and his many memorable books, his assertion about Jesus, you can shut him up you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him a Lord and God. But let us not come any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. It's simplistic and foolish. Lewis said that his aim was to show us why we ought to believe in the divinity of Jesus. Accepting his own postulate, he asserted that this hypothetical man-god had forbidden us to say patronizing nonsense about him, and that we must obey his prohibition. In short, Lewis treated his premise as proof itself. For the man who says he is Jesus, his identity thievery is an existential coup. For psychiatry, such a man, Jesus or poached egg, is an existential and economic goldmine. The fact that modern societies choose to value the products of this salted mine more highly than gold, indeed, that they revere it, is the science and practice of psychiatry, is another issue. It's a freaking societal issue. That's why we don't take it on. Both Russell and Lewis compounded their mistake reasoning about the nature of existential identity theft by assuming that individuals or society need to sanction the thief. Russell declared the lunatic who believes that he is a poached egg is to be condemned solely on the ground that he is in the minority. I don't know if he believed that. You can shut him up, Jesus as a liar, up for a fool. These are non sequitur. There is no need for individuals or society to condemn and punish the existential identity thief. I'm not sure if that's what Russell was saying. He's probably saying that's what society. Severing relations with him suffices for our self-protection. Defining disease. In our time, it is the physician who exercises the cure of souls, and he knows what to do. Doctor, you must travel to the watering place, and then you must keep riding a horse, and then diversion, plenty of diversion. To relieve an anxious conscience? Bosh! Get out with that stuff. An anxious conscience? No such things exist anymore. Soren Kierkegaard. A visit to the doctor. Can medicine abolish the anxious conscience? Parables of Kierkegaard. Illness and healing are as old as civilization. For millennia, the shaman or priest sought to help persons suffering from all manner of human adversities, only some of which we now regard as diseases. Distinguishing between sin and sickness, between faith, healing, and medical treatment was a slow historical process, still incomplete in the minds of millions. Scientific materialist approach to medical healing, a Western European idea, is less than 200 years old. Additionally, the physician was a private entrepreneur. In the United States, only in the 20th century did the federal and state governments begin to regulate and restrict the sale of drugs and the practice of medicine. After the World War II, earlier in the Soviet Union, the distribution of medical services sought throughout the developed world transformed from a capitalist to a socialist system. The source of the physician's income shifted from the patient to the government or a government-regulated insurance. At the same time, more and more personal habits and problems, from smoking to obesity, the management of unruly children, became defined as diseases, and more drugs were removed from the free market and made available only by prescription, only to persons diagnosed as ills and called patients. Western societies were transformed from theocracies to democracies and then to pharmacracies. What should and should not count as a disease is a troubling question for all medicine, especially for those in psychiatry. Everyone, doctors, patients, politicians, and people, has a stake in how we demarcate disease from non-disease. None of these can escape the obligation to grapple with and decide how and where to draw this line. The question requires two different answers: one to satisfy the medical science, another to satisfy the medical practice and the person it serves. Medical science, as part of a natural science, is concerned with the empirical investigation of the material world, human body, by means of precisely defining and rigorously applying concepts and techniques. Medical practice, though based on science and the use of scientific technology, is not a type of human service, content and delivery of which are shaped by economic, ideological, religious, and political interests. In the delivery of medical care, insistence on similar precision and rigor is condemned as rigidity and lack of compassion. Conflict between the need for precision and rigor in practicing science and the need for flexibility and compassion providing medical care is reflected in our current nosology, a mixture of precisely identified natural phenomenon and imprecisely identified economic, ideological, political, and sociological judgments and occurrences. As a result, this classification system is an intellectual embarrassment and an invitation to political economic mischief. Extricating ourselves from the dilemmas of contemporary political healthcare policy requires that we acknowledge the need for two or more systems by defining and classifying diseases. Science is not synonymous with materialism, the study of fact, with things of how things are. It is axiomatic, and that can be no scientific investigation or scientific theory of non-material entities and moral concepts such as angel and devil, spirit and mind, virtue and vice. To say that is not the same as saying that those things do not exist. They, quote, exist, but, quote, they are not part of the material world. Their study entails inquiry into the reasoning about not facts but beliefs, experiences, how things feel, values, good and bad, and social policy. What actions in what circumstances ought to be considered illicit, and all this is commonplace. Nevertheless, prominent medical scientists and prestigious publications regularly ignore, overlook, obscure what we need to use, concept of disease, both as well as value-neutral scientific term to describe and explain aspects of the material world as a value-laden, ethical term to identify, excuse, condemn, and justify non-material human aspirations, laws, and customs, that we ought to distinguish clearly and honestly between these two different meanings and uses of it. For a greater part of the 2,000 years, from the days of Hippocrates, 460 to 380 BC, until the Enlightenment, that's just a guess, physicians and philosophers believe that diseases were caused by disturbances of four basic elements or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with a major organ of the body as anatomy, influenced by astrology rather than by dissection, was then understood. From ancient despots to the political leaders of modern democracies, rulers have sought monopolistic control over the monetary. Modern therapeutic states assume similar monopolistic control over defining diseases and treatment. It's the same thing, guys. Same thing. Formerly, people rushed to embrace totalitarian states. Now they rush to embrace the therapeutic state. By the time they discover that the therapeutic state is about tyranny, not therapy, it will be too late. Please like and subscribe. Continue watching my series regarding anti-psychology and the modern conflict of the faculties, and I'll be reading more Thomas Szasz. Thank you for joining me.